Hey guys, Jason here, back with another TCG extended deck profile. Today's feature deck is one with a pretty extensive backstory, and it's one that features a handful of cards from set 13. It's Auzesu. As many of you know, Alcadeias Lord of Spirits is a card that has been on our radar for a very long time. It's a fan favorite, and its effect has a lot of upside, which makes it a very compelling card to build around. We did whip up some Alcadeias lists several years ago, but the card never made an appearance in TCG Revamped or TCG Explored. To cut a long story short, the card is poorly supported in the TCG environment, so we were never able to come up with a list we were happy with. However, when we started looking into set 13, Damien took notice of some angel commands that were much more impressive than those available in the TCG, one of which being Auzesu, who we see here. After this, we were determined to use these new cards to finally get Alcadeias off the ground. The road to TCG Extended was a very bumpy one for the angel commands, and we were extremely close to scrapping the deck. But I am glad to say, at the very last minute, we were able to settle on a list we were happy with, so here it is. Starting off the deck with the early drops, we've got 3 copies of Poisonous Mushroom, 3 copies of Bronze Arm Tribe, 2 Juliana, and 3 copies of Bellix the Explorer. And on that note, I feel like you might be thinking, the counts here are a bit strange, but don't worry, I'll get into that in just a bit. Because we're running Nature, Mushroom and Bronze Arm are very intuitive picks. They are early drops that ramp mana, and they are prime bait for Soul Swap. But one thing I realized during our testing was that these Nature weenies left a lot to be desired when trying to fend off aggro decks because of how poorly they trade with other creatures. So we decided that we needed some early light drops to fight, and Juliana, being a great anti-aggro card, was perfect for the job. But Juliana alone wasn't enough, because being a 3-drop meant it was still a bit slow of going second. We also found that it could be pretty limited in utility, such as in the later stages of the game or against non-aggro decks. This brings me to Bellix, who was actually a pretty late inclusion, but one we really love. The reason the above creature count is so weird is because we wanted to make space for Bellix. We originally tested Bellix because it was a means of grabbing Soul Swap out of mana, but we soon realized it could do more than just that. Bellix actually provides amazing roll compression in being able to function as an early 2-drop blocker, but unlike the other early drops, it also acts as a tremendous late game top deck thanks to its effect. The final change we made to the deck was swapping the 3rd Juliana for the 3rd Bellix, because Damien felt strongly about Bellix being a 2-drop and having better utility across all stages of the game. And, well, he's not wrong. I guess to finish off the 3 drops, we have a card that costs 3 mana, but doesn't really function like a traditional 3-drop. We are running 4 copies of Soul Swap. This is obviously the reason we run Nature, and I usually talk about Soul Swap pretty late into the deck profile, but I'm going to bring it up now because of how often I'm going to mention it later. Soul Swap's main purpose in the deck is to help cheat out our big creatures. Next up, we have a newcomer. We've got 3 copies of Fallen Monk of the Bloodstained Soil, Zahaku. This dude has probably my favorite name in the entire set. Now, due to the lack of come into play effect, I wouldn't blame you for being a bit underwhelmed by Zahaku, since we certainly were. But when you break down what he brings to the table, you'll come to realize that he actually makes the deck flow a lot better. He is surprisingly decent against aggro decks, because he basically revenge kills anything with less than 5,000 power. He is also able to attack players, which is a huge plus given how many blockers this deck runs. And being mono darkness means he is good for mana, because we previously only ran 7 mono darkness sources plus Auzesu, which was pretty inconsistent. But the main reason we have him is because, thanks to Sympathy, he allows Auzesu to be played a turn early. This is really good at punishing aggro decks, since Auzesu's effect works off any angel or demon command attacking. So, if the Zahaku sticks, Auzesu's effect is basically come into play, and being able to threaten a double kill with Zahaku is really scary for aggro. While we're on the subject of 4-drop darkness cards, it should come as no surprise that we are running 4 copies of Cranium Clamp. Cranium Clamp is the only form of discard we have in the deck, and it's what we think is best. We tried a lot of different discard configurations involving Ghost Touch, Cloned Nightmare, Locomotiver, and Lost Soul, but ultimately we felt that the best configuration was the tried and true 4 clamps. Alright, that's enough talk about old cards. Let's talk about the juicier part of the deck. We've got 3 copies of Newcomer Asteria, Heaven's Blessing Elemental, and 3 copies of the mascot Auzesu, Demonic Elemental. I'll talk about Asteria first, since it is kind of related to Cranium Clamp. Its effect lets the user draw a card each time the opponent draws outside of the start of their turn. This deck does not play any draw, so it often has to rely on Asteria to draw extra cards. We definitely could have played Mysterious, but I think the two are quite similar, so it's one or the other. Mysterious's benefit is that it is more proactive in nature, in that you can trigger the draw yourself, but Asteria being an angel command, and a new card I guess, is what convinced us to run it instead. Asteria does have some synergy with Cranium Clamp, in that clamping the opponent pressures them into drawing extra cards, and if Asteria's out, we get to draw as well. Moving on to the namesake of the deck, we have Auzesu, a really interesting card because of the emotional roller coaster it put us through, as well as its card design. His effect is very cool in that it addresses the fundamental problem Darkness has of not being able to efficiently deal with multiple creatures. But to be honest, it's also essentially a wins all battles clause for when Auzesu attacks. But Auzesu isn't the only multi-civ card in the deck. The other multi-civ card we're running is Skysword the Savage Vizier at 2 copies. We needed some more anti-aggro cards, and Skysword was just perfect for the job. We all know how devastating Soul Swap Skysword is against aggro, and Skysword is also pretty good for nature mana if we manage to charge him early enough. We originally ran 3 copies, but without proactive draw sources, we wanted to cut down on the multi-civ. I felt like running too much multi-civ ruined the flow of the deck, because top-decking multi-civ often impaired our ability to play stuff on curve. So 2 copies is all we can accommodate, but so far it's worked out. Moving on to the finishers, we have 2 copies of Alcadeias Lord of Spirits, 1 Cryptic Totem, and 1 Diamond Cutter. In the case of Alcadeias, well, he just had to make an appearance. This was his last chance, and I think this is also the best vehicle for him. I don't think this inclusion is too forced though, since he does have the advantage of bricking control-oriented strategies and being too big for most creatures to deal with. But I'm not delusional. I know the card is clunky and it has its limitations, which is why I added the silver bullets, so to speak, in Cryptic Totem and Diamond Cutter. The inclusion of Cryptic Totem as an alternate win condition was necessary because Alcadeias isn't the easiest thing to summon, even with the 6 angel commands and Soul Swap. Before we put in Cryptic Totem, we would often get to a point in the game where we'd have built up this massive board of creatures but would still be too scared to break. Cryptic solves that problem by giving the deck a greater sense of purpose and a proper endgame. So instead of patiently waiting for Alcadeias, who might still not guarantee game, we have the option to go for Cryptic instead, who can also be accessed by Soul Swap. Diamond Cutter, like Alcadeias, is a card we've wanted to feature for a very long time. This deck runs a total of 8 blockers, and we found that not being able to go for the one-shot kill, due to many of our creatures being unable to attack players, was a major problem. So the 1 Diamond Cutter aims to address that, and it certainly helps that Bellix can fish it out of mana. We don't run any deck search for it, so the mindset is to just charge it as soon as we see it to keep it safe in mana, since the combination of Bellix and Soul Swap gives us many ways to access it from mana later. Anyway, to finish the deck, we are running 3 copies of Terror Pit and 3 copies of Holy Awe. Terror Pit is 100% necessary here because we need a shield trigger that can affect the board in a meaningful way during all stages of the game, especially the early game. Holy Awe is mainly here because we want the option to be proactive with Auzesu's effect. But I suppose it also has that plot armor factor, and it's the only spell we can cast under Alcadeias lock. For space reasons, we're only running 3 copies, but I think we can get away with this because Belix can grab it out of mana later in the game. And one of Damien's favorite plays is to Belix for Holy Awe and play it on the same turn for a big momentum swing. So here's a nice bird's eye view of the deck. Unlike the other decks that run the Soul Swap package, this deck doesn't quite live and die based on its ability to hit one of the nature weenies early. Because they aren't very good at fighting, and because the deck doesn't have too many advantage-generating cards that work on their own, we really aren't pressured to always open with them. Especially in the case of aggro matchups, this deck can just throw down light blockers and play other stuff on curve. Juliana into Clamp is a particularly noteworthy sequence because of how much it can devastate aggro, but it's not as consistent as it used to be with only 2 Juliana. This is a mid-range deck, so it does have the option to act as the aggressor or defender. Now, given the format, it's usually the latter. We very seldomly attack early with this deck, unless we can rush out Alcadeias against something that cannot out it. For example, a control variant or decks without Surfer. As mentioned, this deck doesn't have proactive draw, so we have to be patient, especially if playing against something that doesn't break early. But I guess it can kind of draw cards using Asteria and Belix late game. The deck usually wants to wait for Cryptic Totem or Alcadeias to play around Trigs, and Diamond Cutter is of course an option for setting up that one-shot kill. In terms of matchups, it's funny because for a while I thought this deck was the clear runt of the litter, but as we played more with the current list, I came to realize it was better than I thought. The deck does better against some aggro decks than others. It's more favored against the ones that aren't as good at getting around blockers. Perhaps more interesting, though, are its matchups against the more control-oriented decks. I feel like on paper, Auzesu should lose, especially because the attack-untap creature mechanic kind of wrecks this deck. But in our testing, this deck has managed to get some wins on Armorloids, Swapbox, and even Deck Out. I still think it's slightly unfavored against those kinds of decks, because the burden is more on Auzesu to get lucky, like with hitting darkness spells at the right times or a Hail Mary Alcadeias, but probably more important than anything is just knowing the matchups. In terms of other options, you could run higher counts of the staple creatures I talked about, Mushroom, Bronze Arm, Juliana, but because of their limited late game utility, I felt it would be better to make space for other cards. Again, Lost Soul and Small Discard, like Locomotiver, is another thing you could try. Locomotiver does have the roll compression aspect of acting as a discard option, while also being a useful trig, especially broken into early. Corpse Charger and Foul were one-ofs in early versions of the deck. These are cards that I sometimes miss, but I don't know what I'd remove to make space for them. Mysterious, as I touched on earlier, can be pretty good, but we wanted to play Asteria instead to better capitalize on the tribal Angel Command theme. Speaking of Angel Commands, Damien really wanted to play Bowholes in the deck, and we were messing around with one copy for a while. But between squeezing in Belix, Cryptic Totem, Diamond Cutter, and Sahaku, we just couldn't find the space for it. And if you don't think nature's the way to go, I think a build with water could have some potential. This is how we most recently tried to build Alcadeias, but we ultimately preferred this version. Now, normally at this point in the video, I would put up a sample list that uses cards only from the global release. But because all of the main cards in the deck are from DM13, I don't think there's a way for me to do that. So, if you're looking for some Angel Command action, I would recommend you check out Halfar's IDC winning Alcadeias deck list. And that brings me to the end of the video. I hope you guys enjoyed that. To be honest, I am more relieved than anything that we finally got Alcadeias off the ground. It has been several years since we last featured him in a deck profile. This deck honestly gave us so much heartache, like a couple of other decks we've done in the past, I guess. And it makes me wonder if we should start a new series, so it's not so much deck profiles, but more like the stories behind each of the decks. Let me know if you'd be interested in that. But anyway, as always, thank you so much for watching, stay safe, and we'll see you guys next time.